The old man sat on a stone ledge overlooking the valley, his fingers gently caressing the worn wooden beads of his mala. The sun had barely risen, but the horizon was already glowing, a soft golden hue spilling across the peaks, like paint from an unseen brush. The village below was still asleep, lost in its dreams and silences. But he had been awake for hours, not out of habit, out of something deeper, a sense of knowing, of readiness, of closure perhaps. For years he had wandered, through cities buzzing with distraction, forests echoing with truth, temples humming with prayer, and deserts empty enough to show him everything he'd been hiding. He had been many things in many lives: teacher, monk, seeker, wanderer. But this morning he was just a witness to the life that had unfolded within him, like a flower too slow for the world to see bloom. He had arrived in this village months ago, unknown and unnoticed. People here had grown used to the mountains deciding who stayed and who left. And so when he came, dressed plainly, asking for nothing but a small room and the rhythm of quiet days, no one questioned it. They saw his eyes and understood he wasn't lost. He was simply returning. The children loved him first, not because he told them stories or played games, but because he saw them, really saw them. When they ran barefoot down the dust-lined roads, he didn't scold their laughter. He bowed to it, and they in return brought him flowers, small pebbles they found beautiful, questions with no answers. One girl asked him why the clouds move so slowly. He smiled and said, "Because the sky is patient." She giggled and repeated it all day as if it were the wisest thing she had ever heard. The elders in the village took longer. They watched him from a distance, wondering what brought him here, whether he was carrying sorrow or seeking peace. But he never offered a story, only presence. And slowly they began to accept it, because presence, when offered without condition, softens even the most skeptical hearts. Each morning, he would walk the same path that looped behind the village and curved around the mountain's edge. It wasn't a dramatic trail, no breathtaking views, no sacred landmarks, but it was honest. It carried the scent of pine, the crunch of gravel underfoot, and the rhythm of birdsong that felt like prayer. He walked not to reach anywhere, but to remember he had legs, that his body, though older now, was still a temple. Sometimes he would stop by the stream that cut through the forest and sit on a stone, dipping his fingers into the water. It was cold, always cold, but it carried something sacred. The kind of sacred that doesn't declare itself, but waits to be noticed. He once whispered to the stream, "You've never rushed, yet you've never stopped flowing. Teach me that." And though the stream said nothing, it seemed to nod in agreement. In the evenings, he would return to the village and sit outside the small home he'd been given, sipping warm tea brewed with mint leaves and memory. The sun would fall behind the mountains, casting long shadows that reached across the earth, like arms trying to hold everything one last time before night took over. He never feared the dark. Darkness had been his teacher longer than most people had been his companions. He would watch the villagers return from their days, women carrying baskets of vegetables, men with dust on their forearms, children with tangled hair and open laughter. And he would smile, not out of politeness, but from a place deeper, a smile that said, "I see you, all of you, and you are enough." One night, a boy sat beside him without a word, maybe 10 years old, eyes too wide for his face, filled with questions he hadn't yet learned how to ask. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, the boy said, "Are you wise?" The old man laughed, a quiet laugh, like leaves brushing against stone. "Sometimes I remember things that help me forget the noise," he replied. The boy didn't understand, but he liked the way it sounded, so he nodded, satisfied. Over time, others began to sit with him too. Not to learn, not to be taught, just to be. A woman who had lost her husband brought him soup one evening, tears still hiding in her eyes. She didn't speak, but he bowed his head as she handed it to him. And in that gesture, something shifted in her. Another man, older, burdened by a mistake he refused to name, once asked, "Can silence forgive us?" The old man placed his palm on the man's shoulder and said, "It already has. Now let yourself do the same." He never claimed to be a teacher, never offered guidance unless it was asked, and even then his answers were questions dressed in poetry. He didn't believe in fixing people. He believed in listening to them, in letting them remember they had always been whole beneath the forgetting. One morning, the youngest of the children brought him a bird with a broken wing. The bird was trembling, fear and pain wrapped into its tiny body. The old man took it gently, held it close to his chest, and whispered something so softly no one else could hear. He then wrapped the wing with cloth and placed the bird in a box lined with warmth and patience. For days he fed it, talked to it, let it feel the safety of presence. And one morning, without announcement, the bird flew. The girl clapped with joy. The old man simply smiled and said, "We don't need to teach birds how to fly. We only need to remind them they're not alone while they're healing." That became a kind of truth for the village. That healing didn't come from doing, it came from being, from slowing down enough to notice where it hurt, from allowing others to witness your wounds without flinching, from breathing through the parts of yourself you once tried to hide. As the seasons shifted and the leaves turned gold and red, the village began to change too. Not in structure, not in rules, but in presence. People moved a little slower, listened a little longer, spoke with more space between their words. It wasn't because the old man had told them to. It was because they had seen what it looked like to be fully here. And once you see that, you can't go back to pretending you're not. The old man never said he was leaving. He simply began to walk further on his morning paths, sometimes disappearing for a day or two, once for 3. And when he returned, there was more stillness in him than before, as if the mountain had whispered something only he could hear. No one asked where he went. They didn't need to know. His presence when he returned was enough. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, tiny flakes dancing in the air like memories made visible, he sat again on the stone ledge above the valley. This time, he brought no beads, no blanket, not even tea, just himself. And as the stars blinked into the sky and the cold crept into the bones of the earth, he closed his eyes and whispered, "I am here." It wasn't a beginning. It wasn't an end. It was everything in between. The snow kept falling through the night, each flake surrendering to the silence like it had always known how. No rush, no sound, just the gentle descent of cold softness meeting earth. The village below stirred in sleep, unaware that something sacred had been taking place above them. Something not marked by thunder or fanfare, but by breath and stillness. The old man remained on the ledge until dawn began to paint its first color across the sky. The snow settled like a shawl around his shoulders. By the time the villagers awoke, he was gone. Not vanished, just no longer where he had been. They didn't search frantically. There was no panic, just a quiet understanding that sometimes those who come to remind you of yourself don't stay. Sometimes they walk deeper into the forest, or higher into the mountain, or further into the silence because their purpose wasn't to remain. It was to spark remembrance. And the villagers, in their own quiet wisdom, chose to honor that. Still, his absence was felt like an ache in the air. The children waited by his old house, hoping to hear his laugh. The woman who had once brought him soup now brought it anyway and left it by his door, even though the door remained unopened. The man who had once asked about silence found himself sitting alone on the bench they used to share, feeling how empty presence can still be full. The village changed again, but this time not through his presence, but through the echo of it. The old man's departure did not create a hole. It created a doorway. People began stepping into it slowly. They started watching the sunrise more, walking paths they used to ignore, listening to the wind as though it might say something meaningful. And for the first time in years, they began talking to each other differently. Not louder, not more often, just differently. They asked softer questions, left longer pauses between thoughts, looked into each other's eyes without rushing to speak. One could say the village became quieter, but that quiet wasn't empty. It was alive, as if the very air was listening. A group of children formed a habit of gathering at the old man's favorite stone in the forest. They would sit in a circle and try to remember the things he had said, not to memorize them, but to feel them again. "The sky is patient," the little girl would say, laughing. "The river doesn't rush but never stops," another would add. And one day, when a boy arrived crying over something he refused to explain, none of them tried to fix it. They simply sat close, offering their presence like warm blankets. And slowly the crying turned into silence, and the silence into peace. The elders too began their own form of remembering. Some started tending to gardens they had let fall into neglect. Others began writing again. Short poems, journal entries, memories too beautiful to lose. One man, once known for his harshness, was seen sitting beside the stream, dipping his hand into the water and staring into it for hours. When asked what he was doing, he simply said, "Learning how to be gentle again." Even the wind in the village seemed different. It wasn't a metaphor. They felt it. It carried something, a tenderness, as if the old man had poured a bit of his breath into it, and now it moved through the trees, reminding everyone how to feel more slowly. Even the birds took longer pauses between flights. Time itself began to bend, not in hours or minutes, but in attention. Mornings no longer began with urgency. People greeted each other, not out of politeness, but recognition. Children no longer needed reasons to play barefoot in the dust, and no one told them to stop. One day a stranger arrived, a traveler with eyes too tired for his young face. He had heard of the village in stories passed between wanderers, in whispers around campfires, in pages of forgotten books. He had come looking for the man who had taught people how to be still. But when he asked, no one pointed him to a house or a person. They simply said, "He's everywhere." The traveler was confused. He had expected a teacher, a figure wrapped in mystery, someone who would sit him down and show him the path. But instead, he was handed a cup of tea by a boy no older than 10. The boy said nothing, just sat beside him and sipped his own tea, as if that was all the lesson he needed. The traveler stayed for weeks trying to find the wisdom he'd heard about, but the villagers never preached. They never quoted. They simply lived. One morning, he woke before the sun and saw an old woman sweeping the road with the softest strokes, her breath visible in the cold. Another day, he watched two friends sit for hours without words under a tree that had lost all its leaves. And slowly, he began to understand. The wisdom wasn't in the words. It was in the waiting. It was in the way people carried water without rushing, in the way meals were cooked as rituals, not chores, in the way laughter echoed without needing an audience. He had come seeking answers and found questions that didn't need to be solved. He had come to be taught and ended up remembering how to listen. One evening, he walked to the stone ledge where the old man used to sit. He sat there alone, wind against his face, stars gathering above. And in that silence, something in him broke, not with pain, but with release. He cried without knowing why, cried for everything he'd carried, for the years of pretending, for the noise he had mistaken for life. And when the crying ended, he felt lighter, emptier in a way that made space for breath. He stayed until the first light touched the mountains. Then he whispered, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure to whom. And when he returned to the village, he didn't need to ask questions anymore. He simply helped an old man carry wood, shared a loaf of bread with a stranger, sat with the children and listened to their stories. And the villagers welcomed him, not as a student, not as a guest, but as one of their own, because they recognized the stillness beginning to grow inside him. He never found the old man, but eventually he stopped looking, Because in every quiet act, in every shared moment, in every pause that held the fullness of now, he felt the old man's presence. Not as a memory, but as a truth. And that was enough. The mountains were breathing, not literally, but in a way only those who had learned how to listen could understand. The clouds moved slower here, brushing across the sky as if they too had been taught to soften. Trees no longer stood as obstacles in a path. They stood as companions, ancient and unmoving, offering shade, quiet, and the wisdom of stillness. The traveler, who had now become something else entirely, noticed this without effort. Where once his eyes had darted, searching for signs or meanings, they now lingered, on moss, on bark, on the movement of wind through branches. He no longer needed life to shout at him. A whisper was enough. One morning before the sun had fully risen, he returned to the stone ledge. It was colder than before. The kind of cold that crept into your breath, reminded you that you were alive in your bones. He sat down slowly, wrapped in a thick wool shawl someone in the village had given him. The world was still, caught between night and day, and in that in-between space, something sacred always seemed to dwell. He didn't speak. There was no one to listen, but words still filled him. Not like a speech, but like a prayer. He thought of the life he'd left behind, the pace, the ambition, the chasing of shadows, and he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to before. He had never truly known what it meant to be alive. He had tasted adrenaline, yes, sharp thrill of temporary wins, the rush of a fast life, but he hadn't tasted presence. Not like this. Not the kind that makes you cry just because the sun rose again. He remembered with aching clarity how many people he had passed by in the cities, faces hurried, hands busy, eyes focused on destinations rather than presence. He remembered how many people he had loved half-heartedly, distracted by fear or the illusion of more important things. And most painfully, he remembered how long he had lived without ever looking at himself with tenderness. But the pain didn't make him close. It made him open. That was the gift of stillness. It didn't hide your wounds. It sat with them until they softened, until they told you what they had been trying to say all along. Later that day, he walked through the village with slower steps than usual, not out of weariness, but reverence. Every doorway told a story. Every wrinkle on the faces of elders seemed like calligraphy carved by time. He smiled at a boy who was stacking stones into a tower by the side of the road. The boy grinned back and said, "I'm making a home for ants." The simplicity of it hit him like poetry. He kneeled beside the boy and asked, "Do they like living in towers?" The boy nodded, wide-eyed. "They like being high up. They feel important." The traveler laughed, but not at the boy, at the truth hidden in his words. How many towers had he built in his own life, chasing importance, hoping that elevation might offer him something presence never could? How many layers had he stacked just to feel like he mattered? He helped the boy adjust one of the stones, and together they finished the little tower. Before leaving, the boy said, "If you ever need to hide, you can come here." That sentence lingered in his chest like incense. He thanked the boy and walked on, the world now a little more magical than it had been minutes before. That evening, as twilight cloaked the village in quiet hues, he sat with one of the elders by a fire. The woman had seen many seasons, her face a landscape of stories untold. They didn't speak for a long time, just shared heat and breath and the sound of wood crackling between them. Eventually, she said, "Do you know why he left?" Her voice was soft but firm. He didn't have to ask who she meant. "I don't," he said truthfully. She nodded slowly. "Neither do I, but I think he didn't leave us. I think he became part of the mountain." He didn't respond, but something in his chest loosened. It wasn't about where the old man had gone. It was about what he had left behind. Not in objects, not in stories, but in attention. Presence, once shared truly, never disappears. It settles into the soil, the wind, the spaces people forget to look, and it waits for someone who knows how to notice. Over the next few weeks, the traveler became less of a traveler. He stopped thinking about the road, stopped imagining his next place. Something in him had rooted here, not in geography, but in rhythm. He spent more time listening than speaking. He tended the community garden with hands he'd once only used for building businesses. He learned to cook simple meals and offer them without fanfare. He found joy in carrying water, in sweeping floors, in mending clothes. Things that once felt below him now felt like prayers. He wasn't trying to become holy. He was just learning how to be human again. One afternoon, he found a small injured bird near the edge of the path. It reminded him of the story the children had told, the one about the old man healing a bird's broken wing. He picked the bird up gently, felt its heartbeat fluttering like a leaf caught in wind. He took it home, lined a small box with soft cloth, and sat beside it through the night. Not doing anything, just being there, just breathing together. The bird didn't fly away the next day, or the day after, but it began to sing, and in that song he felt a kind of forgiveness, like life saying, "Thank you for showing up." He wrote again in his journal. The entries were different now, less about thoughts, more about experiences. One line read, "Today I watched a shadow dance on the wall and felt like I understood death." Another said, "I am no longer afraid of the dark. It is where the softest things grow." And another simply, "I am." He had never known the power of that phrase until now. I am, without adjectives, without accomplishments, just existence, just being. That was enough. In time, people began asking him questions, not because he had become a teacher, but because he had become a mirror. And he answered not with knowledge, but with space, with silence, with questions that led them back to themselves. One woman asked how to find peace, and he handed her a cup of tea and said, "Drink this slowly." He wasn't performing wisdom, he was living presence. And the village, already softened by the old man's time there, received him not as a replacement, but as a continuation. Another thread in the fabric of their collective remembering. Another heartbeat in the rhythm of their return to slowness, to depth, to grace. At night, he still visited the ledge, not to seek answers, just to sit, just to watch the stars do what they've always done, shine without needing to be seen. And as winter began to whisper again, he wrapped himself in the same shawl and whispered back, "I'm not waiting for spring. I'm already blooming." The snow had started again, this time more like a dance than a descent. Flakes floated in every direction, caught by invisible hands in the wind. He watched them from the doorway of his small room, wrapped in a blanket, holding a bowl of warm lentils. There was something about the way the world softened under snow that reminded him of forgiveness. The kind that didn't need words, the kind that arrived when you simply let it. The kind that wrapped around you like wool, asking for nothing in return. He ate slowly, savoring the warmth of each bite, not because the food was extraordinary, but because it was real. Simple things had taken on a new depth for him. The curve of a wooden spoon, the rhythm of chewing, the steam that rose and disappeared before it could be touched. Every act of living had become a ceremony. Later, he stepped out into the snow with bare hands, wanting to feel the cold against his skin. It wasn't punishing, not today. It was honest. And in its honesty, he felt awake. He walked toward the trees where the path narrowed, the same route the old man had taken so many times. The footprints from his last visit had been covered, erased by fresh layers, but he didn't need them. The trail was written in him now. As he walked, the forest greeted him without sound. The trees stood like monks in silent prayer, their branches bowed under the weight of white. Every crackle beneath his boots felt like punctuation in a sentence nature had been writing for centuries. He paused often, not because he was tired, but because he didn't want to miss anything. There was a clearing ahead that he had passed many times, but today he stepped into it with new eyes. In the center stood a stone, tall, wide, weathered. Not a monument, not a marker, just a stone, but it called to him. He placed a palm on it and closed his eyes. The cold soaked into his hand, but so did something else, a pulse, a presence, a memory too old to belong to him, but somehow familiar. He stayed there a while, not needing to understand, just willing to feel. On his way back, he noticed animal tracks near the stream. Small, delicate, probably a fox or a deer. The idea of wildness comforted him, that something moved through the woods without permission, unbothered by fences or borders. That kind of freedom had once terrified him. Now he longed for it. He returned to the village as evening fell, the snow glowing under a pale moon. Smoke curled from chimneys. Windows blinked with candlelight. The world looked like a painting made by someone who loved stillness. He breathed in deeply before entering his home, letting the cold remind him he was alive. That night he didn't light a fire. He simply wrapped himself in layers and sat by the window, watching the snow drift sideways in the wind. Inside him, something stirred, not restlessness, not longing, just a quiet movement, like a tide, like something readying itself to be let go. He took out his notebook and wrote, "I am learning the language of silence. Each day it speaks to me in new shapes. I don't always understand, but I always feel." The next morning he was visited by a young woman from the village. Her eyes were wide with hesitation. She held something in her hands, a bundle wrapped in cloth. She said nothing, just handed it to him. Inside was a loaf of bread in a small drawing. The bread was fresh, the kind you could taste in the air before you even bit into it. The drawing was of him sitting under a tree, with a line beneath it that read, "The man who listens like trees do." He looked up, surprised. The girl's cheeks flushed. "My daughter drew it," she said. "She says you remind her of the mountains. She says you don't talk a lot, but you still say things." He felt something tighten in his chest and then loosen. "Thank her for me," he said, voice low. After she left, he placed the drawing on his table, next to a smooth river stone he had found a week ago. Two offerings from the world, one made of paper, one of earth, both reminding him that presence leaves an imprint, even when you say nothing. He kept the fire unlit again that night, letting the cold and quiet be his companions. Over the following days, people began stopping by more often, not for advice, not for answers, just to sit. Some brought food, others brought stories. One man brought his silence, and they shared it like tea. The room became a sanctuary, not because it was decorated or sacred, but because it held space, real space, the kind that asks nothing of you but your breath. One boy came by regularly, always with questions, deep ones, like, where do thoughts go when we forget them? And why do some people talk to the moon? The man never gave direct answers. He'd simply smile and respond with something the boy would have to sit with. Maybe thoughts are seeds and forgetting is just where they rest. Or maybe the moon is the only one who's always listening. The boy would leave with furrowed brows, thinking, always thinking, and the man would smile, knowing the questions were doing their work. He began walking different paths through the forest, not to escape the known ones, but to meet new moments. One trail led him to a fallen tree covered in moss, like a velvet shroud for the once living. He sat there for hours, hand resting on the wood, listening to the way it held time. He didn't need to name the feeling. He just let it settle into him like snow. He wrote in his notebook again that night, "I'm no longer chasing the light. I am walking with it." One evening he heard music, soft, distant, carried by the wind. He followed it and found a group gathered near the village center, playing instruments, humming old songs that didn't belong to any one person. He didn't join the circle, just stood nearby, heart open, eyes soft. Music had a way of saying everything he never could. And as he stood there, he remembered dancing in his youth, wild, loud, free, and how long it had been since his body had moved without caution. So he closed his eyes and swayed. Just slightly, just enough, and no one noticed and no one needed to. That was the beauty of this life. You could be fully alive and not make a sound. As the season shifted again, the snow began to melt, and patches of earth returned. The river grew louder. Birds sang more freely. The village moved into a new rhythm, planting, mending, clearing space for growth. And he too began clearing, not his home, his heart. He sat one morning and whispered to himself, "What do I still carry that no longer needs to be held?" And his breath answered. The sun had started to return with more certainty now. It rose earlier with the kind of golden confidence that made the hills blush and the roofs of the village glow like they had been kissed by time itself. Where once snow had softened every edge, now the melt revealed outlines again. The cracks in the stone walls, the lines in the soil, the grooves in old wooden doors. Nothing was hidden anymore, and that somehow made everything more beautiful. He stepped outside and felt the earth beneath his feet, not as something to stand on, but something to stand with. The ground had thawed just enough to offer the smell of roots. He breathed it in slowly, letting it remind him that life doesn't begin again by force. It begins again by warming, by listening, by trusting the return of softness. In the village, people were busy again, not in a rushed or frenzied way, but in a way that made sense. The kind of busyness that follows rest, the kind that knows when to stop. They moved with purpose, but without pressure. A new season of planting had begun, and so the soil called to their hands and their breath. And the man, now fully part of this rhythm, moved with them. He helped where he could, carrying baskets, turning earth, fetching water. He didn't speak much during those tasks. No one did. It wasn't needed. When hands work with the ground, the body speaks a different language. And in that language, everything becomes sacred. A seed, a gesture, a pause to wipe sweat from a brow. He started to notice how everyone had their own rhythm with the land, and that no two were the same. Some moved quickly, almost dancing. Others were slow and deliberate, as if speaking to each root before placing it. One afternoon, while planting beside an older woman who barely spoke at all, he found himself overcome by emotion. Not sorrow, not joy, just depth. A kind of sacred ache in the chest that told him he was exactly where he needed to be. She didn't ask what was wrong. She simply handed him a piece of bread she tucked in her coat, and they ate in silence, dirt still on their hands, eyes on the sky. In the evenings, after the work was done, he sat by the river more often. It had grown louder now with the melting snow, its surface rippling like laughter you can't quite hear, but feel all the same. He sat with his knees pulled to his chest, elbows resting gently on them, eyes following the current as it moved past without ever looking back. There was something in the way the river held everything without clinging. It reminded him of grief, of love, of all the moments in life that pass through you, not to stay, but to shape you. One night, a young girl came to sit beside him. She was no older than 7, but her eyes held the kind of quiet that adults often spend years trying to reclaim. "Do you ever talk to the water?" she asked. He smiled softly. "Every time I sit here." "What does it say back?" He thought for a moment, then answered, "It doesn't speak in words. It reminds me how to let go." She nodded like she understood more than she should, then placed a small leaf on the surface of the water and watched it float away. "That's my worry," she said. "I told it to take it." He looked at her amazed, not by her words, but by the honesty in them. There was a lesson in that moment, but it wasn't one he needed to teach. It was one he needed to receive. He started making it a habit to place something in the river each time he visited. A stone with a memory, a petal with a name, a breath with no explanation. It became a kind of ritual, not to get rid of anything, but to honor that nothing truly stays and nothing truly leaves. The trees had begun to show signs of blooming. Tiny green tips pushed through old branches like shy thoughts trying to become feelings. And with every bud, something in him stretched too. A kind of readiness, a quiet reaching toward the light. Not because he lacked it, but because it's in our nature to grow toward warmth. He started walking further into the woods again, places he hadn't been since the snow arrived. There was one trail in particular, narrow, overgrown, almost hidden, that he followed one day without knowing why. The deeper he walked, the quieter it got. Not the kind of quiet that comes from emptiness, the kind that comes from fullness. Like everything was listening, and he had finally remembered how to speak. He came upon a clearing, unexpected and untouched. In the center stood a tree that didn't look like the others, older, wider, as if it had been waiting for him. He approached it slowly, reverently, and sat at its base. The trunk behind him was solid, warm, familiar. He closed his eyes, rested his head against it, and for the first time in a long time, allowed himself to ask a question he had avoided. What do I still fear? The answers didn't come in thoughts. They came in sensations, a tightening in the chest, a flicker of shame, a memory of being abandoned, another of disappointing someone. He didn't try to push them away, he just breathed. Saturday. Let the tree hold him. When he finally opened his eyes, the sky had shifted colors again. Dusk, the time between, where light and dark shake hands. He stood, touched the bark, whispered, "Thank you," and walked back to the village with something new in his breath, a lightness that hadn't been there before. That night he wrote only one sentence in his notebook. Healing isn't forgetting, it's remembering and not running. The village was different now too, not in buildings or landscape, but in texture. You could feel it in how people hugged longer, how meals were shared slower, how stories were told more often, not because they needed to be heard, but because someone needed to tell them. He listened to more stories these days, not always because he wanted to, but because listening had become his way of loving. Some stories rambled, some hurt, some made no sense at all, but they were all sacred, because they came from someone willing to share what had once been buried. He remembered something the old man had once said, through the voice of a child or maybe a wind, to be seen without being solved, that is what saves us. And so he kept seeing, even when it was hard, even when he didn't understand. He saw the way a woman picked at her food when talking about her past, the way a man clenched his fist when describing his dreams, the way a boy laughed louder than necessary to hide a sadness too big for his age. And he didn't fix it. He just stayed. That, he was learning, was the most radical thing you could do in a world addicted to doing. You could stay. The days began arriving with more warmth now, not just in the temperature of the air, but in the way the wind carried itself. Less biting, more like an embrace. It rustled through the trees with a soft voice, a language only those who moved slowly enough could understand. Birds returned with their songs, and the village filled once again with the quiet hum of life pressing forward, not in haste, but in rhythm. He walked through this changing landscape like someone who had finally found the right pace, the right volume, the right way to move through a world that once asked him to hurry. The garden behind his small home had started blooming, not because he planned it, but because someone had once planted something there, and it had waited patiently beneath the frost. He found small white flowers peeking through the soil, their petals unfolding like stories being told without fear. He crouched beside them each morning, touching the soil gently, as if greeting an old friend returned from a long silence. He didn't need to plant much. The earth had been cared for by others. All it asked from him now was attention, presence. A soft thank you whispered in the way he watered it, sat beside it, watched it grow. The children visited often, their shoes muddy, hair wild, cheeks red from playing under the sun that now stayed longer in the sky. One of them, the boy who had once asked why people talked to the moon, now brought with him a sketchbook. He would sit near the man, drawing birds, branches, and sometimes just shapes he claimed were feelings that don't have names. They didn't talk much, but the boy's silence was never empty. It was filled with the sound of pencils scratching paper, of thoughts being translated into lines. One day, the boy showed him a drawing of two trees standing side by side. One tall, straight, full of leaves, and the other smaller, crooked, with bare branches. "This one," he said, pointing to the smaller tree, "is the strongest, because it had to survive the most." The man said nothing at first, just nodded, then reached over and gently touched the page. "And which one are you?" he asked. The boy thought for a moment. "Both," he whispered. That night he sat with those words in his chest, letting them echo. We are all both, the strong and the scarred, the blooming and the bare. There was something liberating in that truth, that you didn't have to be one thing forever, that some parts of you could be thriving while others were still trying to find the light. And both were holy. The villagers had begun preparing for a gathering, a festival of sorts to welcome the new season. Not the kind of festival with fanfare or noise, but one rooted in tradition. They painted old cloths with natural dyes, hung strings of flowers between the homes, prepared meals passed down through generations. It was a celebration of survival, of return, of the quiet strength that comes from getting through a long winter with your heart still open. He was asked to help, and so he did, not as an outsider anymore, but as someone who belonged. He carried baskets, stirred pots over fire, arranged stones into pathways. But most of all, he listened to stories shared over cooking, to laughter rising from shared work, to silence held between those who had nothing to prove but everything to offer. During the festival, the villagers gathered in the field near the river. Candles floated in bowls along the water, their flames trembling but unafraid. Children danced in circles. Elders sat close, sharing memories. And music rose, not from instruments, but from voices, simple, layered, honest. He stood at the edge for a long while, watching, feeling, not needing to join, not needing to leave, just witnessing. And then a woman, one of the elders, approached and offered her hand. "You've given us your silence," she said. "Tonight, give us your dance." He hesitated, smiled, and took her hand. He danced not like someone performing, but like someone remembering. His body moved without choreography, guided by the rhythm of breath and belonging. And for a moment, time dissolved. There was no past chasing him, no future calling him, just the ground, the night, the stars above, and the pulse of presence. After the dance, he walked to the river alone. The candles were still floating, reflections shimmering like distant echoes. He knelt by the water, touched its surface with his fingers, and whispered a thank you, not just for the evening, but for everything that had led him here. Every ache, every detour, every moment of solitude that prepared him to receive peace without needing to explain it. He returned home late, the kind of tired that feels good in the bones. He laid on his back, eyes open, letting the quiet of the village settle around him. He thought about how many years he had searched for this. Not the village, not the people, but this feeling, this surrender. He wrote again before sleep, "Peace does not arrive loudly. It walks in when you've stopped asking it to." In the days that followed, he felt a new ease within himself, not because life had become simple, but because he no longer complicated it. When he ate, he tasted. When he walked, he felt the ground. When he cried, he did not wipe the tears away quickly. He let them fall like sacred offerings. Every moment now was allowed its fullness. He began teaching, not through lectures or lessons, but through presence. When someone asked a question, he would ask one back. When someone cried, he would sit beside them until the crying passed. When someone laughed, he would let it linger in the room longer than necessary, as if laughter itself was a visitor that deserved respect. People started calling him elder, though he never claimed the title. It didn't matter to him. Labels no longer held weight. What mattered was the way people showed up for each other. What mattered was the love that no longer needed grand gestures to be felt. He continued visiting the old tree on the hidden path. Each time he arrived, it felt different. Sometimes he sat in silence. Other times he brought stones from the river and placed them at its base. Once he carved a single word into its bark. Here, it was not graffiti, it was an offering. It reminded him that being present wasn't something you did once. It was a practice, a becoming, an unlearning of everything that told you you had to be somewhere else. He had stopped making plans, not because he feared the future, but because the present was finally enough. He spent time with the man who had once asked if silence could forgive him. They didn't talk about that anymore. They talked about birds, about recipes, about how the moon always seems closer when you're willing to look up. The man smiled more now, walked a little straighter, carried less, and the woman who used to leave soup on his doorstep had started singing again. Softly at first and then louder when she realized people weren't listening to judge, but to feel. That perhaps was the greatest change, not in the man, not in the village, but in the air between people. It had become safer, warmer, softer, like a blanket you wrap around a child without needing to say why. He understood now, in a way that only quiet can teach. Healing is not about return, it's about arrival. It's not about becoming someone else. It's about finally meeting yourself and staying. Morning light crept through the window slowly, like it had learned not to wake him too quickly. The warmth of the sun kissed the edges of the floor, and the smell of earth still lingered from yesterday's rain. He stirred from sleep, not with urgency, but with reverence. Every morning now felt like an invitation, not to do, not to prove, just to be. And that, he had discovered, was enough. He sat at the edge of his bed, bare feet touching the cool wood, and allowed himself a few quiet moments before standing. There was no ritual to perform, no meditation that had to be completed. Just awareness. He listened to the sound of his own breath, steady and grounded. He placed a hand on his chest, not to check for anything, but to acknowledge that he was still here, still alive, still arriving. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. A child laughed somewhere in the distance. A dog barked once and then fell silent. Birds sang their daily praise to the morning, and smoke began curling from a chimney down the hill. Everything was moving, but none of it rushed. The world had learned, or maybe remembered, how to be slow. He stepped outside, shawl wrapped loosely over his shoulders. The path to the garden was still damp, and the scent of wet soil rose like incense. He knelt and touched the leaves, brushing a bit of dirt from their tips, offering a gentle thank you to whatever unseen hand kept them growing. He no longer asked the earth to produce. He simply shared space with it. The small white flowers had multiplied, scattered like stars across the garden bed. He didn't know their names, but he knew what they meant to him. They were proof that beauty arrives without permission, that something can bloom even after the coldest winters. That softness, when tended to, never really disappears. It just hides until it feels safe again. He walked through the village slowly. The woman who once sang quietly now sang aloud as she hung laundry. The boy with the sketchbook had drawn birds across a wall with charcoal, and no one had stopped him. People nodded to each other with more eye contact, more pauses between their words. Even the silences shared between villagers felt warmer now, less like gaps and more like bridges. He visited the old bench near the stream and sat down, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. It was a letter he had written to no one and everyone. He read it silently, not because he had forgotten what it said, but because the act of reading it reminded him of who he had become. I no longer seek answers. I seek presence. I no longer crave arrival. I welcome becoming. There is no final version of me waiting to be unlocked. Only this one, the one who breathes, the one who notices, the one who stays. He refolded the paper and placed it back in his pocket. A boy came and sat beside him, the same one who once talked about towers for ants. They didn't speak for several minutes, just listened to the stream as it hummed its way through the stones. Eventually the boy asked, "Do you ever miss the places you were before?" The man looked at the boy, thoughtful. "Sometimes, but I don't live there anymore." "Did they make you sad?" "Not always, but I made myself sad in them by trying to be something I wasn't ready to be." The boy nodded slowly, processing, then asked, "And now?" The man smiled, looking out over the water. "Now I just try to be." The boy didn't reply. He didn't need to. He leaned into the man's side just enough to share warmth, and they sat like that for a while. Two different ages, two different stories, one shared silence. That evening, the stars came out more brightly than they had in weeks. The sky felt close, like it had lowered itself for the sake of intimacy. He sat on his roof, wrapped in his blanket, sipping tea, watching constellations appear one by one. He didn't name them. He didn't need to. They were not there to be conquered by his knowledge. They were there to be seen. That was all. A memory rose from within him, one he hadn't visited in years. A moment from childhood, lying in a field, staring up at the stars with someone he once loved. He didn't remember the words they'd exchanged, only the feeling of her hand resting beside his, close but not touching. That memory came back now, not to bring sorrow, but to remind him. Presence is timeless. It doesn't belong to the past or the future. It lives inside the moments we fully inhabit, and those moments never die. They stay, tucked into the folds of who we become. He whispered into the sky, "Thank you." And it felt like an answer to everything that had ever been unanswered. The next day, the villagers gathered again, not for any particular reason, just because they could. They shared food, stories, and silence. A child performed a play she had written, full of made-up creatures and forgotten dreams. People laughed, not because the play made sense, but because it made them feel. An old man told a story that no one could follow, but no one interrupted him. It wasn't about understanding. It was about witnessing. The man sat near the edge of the circle, watching it all. There was a kind of sacredness in this togetherness. Not manufactured, not forced, just true. It reminded him of a truth he had once resisted, that healing doesn't always happen alone. Sometimes it happens when we are seen, heard, held, without correction, without urgency, without judgment. Someone asked him to share something, and for a moment he hesitated, but then he stood. He didn't clear his throat or prepare a speech. He just looked at the people, all gathered in their soft humanity, and said, "There was a time I thought I needed to go far away to find myself, and maybe I did. But what I've learned is this: you are never really far from yourself. You're just waiting for the noise to die down." He paused. "And once the noise quiets, the path is always right beneath your feet." Then he sat back down. No one applauded. No one needed to. They just looked at him with quiet eyes. And that look, that shared stillness, said more than any words could. That night he dreamed of rivers, not one but many, intersecting, crossing paths, separating again. And he was floating, not on one, but between them. Each river carried a different version of him, and none of them were wrong. He woke up with tears on his cheeks, not from sadness, from recognition. He wrote in his notebook, "Every version of me has loved. Every version of me has tried. I don't need to abandon any of them to be whole." Spring arrived quietly, as it always does. The trees bloomed without asking for applause. The birds returned without needing to announce themselves. The world came back to life not because it was commanded to, but because it knew how. And so did he, not in dramatic ways, but in the smallest ones. He stood more upright now, not from pride, but from peace. His hands moved with more care. His voice softened even more, especially when speaking to himself. He caught himself smiling at random moments, when folding clothes, when hearing footsteps on gravel, when watching a bee circle a flower. He had become someone else, yes, but more importantly, he had become himself. The rhythm of the village had become the rhythm of his breath. Days flowed into nights like a soft chant, repeating not out of monotony, but as a way to deepen, to remember. Each moment, no matter how small, carried the weight of a full life. When he lit a candle, it wasn't just to chase darkness away, it was to honor light. When he drank tea, it wasn't to quench thirst, it was to meet the present with both hands. He began waking before the sun again. Not because he had to, because he wanted to greet the world before it opened its eyes. There was something holy about those early hours. The hush before sound, the air, untouched by conversation, the sky, still deciding which colors to wear. He would walk the path behind his house barefoot, letting the cold soil remind him that he had a body, that he had arrived here, that he was real. One morning, he brought a small bowl of rice and placed it near the tree at the edge of the woods. A quiet offering, not to anyone in particular, just to the unseen, to the ancestors, to the wind, to whatever presence had carried him through all the years he thought he was walking alone. He whispered, "I didn't know you were here all along, but now that I do, I won't forget again." The act of offering, even something so small, became a practice for him. He would leave bits of food for the birds, pour water for the roots, bow his head slightly when passing the old stone near the stream. It wasn't religious. It wasn't performative. It was gratitude made visible, and gratitude